He died after cutting me out. Then, his lawyer dropped a bomb. My name built his empire. A sealed letter and a house key forced me to choose what's next.
The call came on a Tuesday morning, while I was scrubbing burnt eggs from my skillet, the kind of stubborn mess that comes from cooking with a distracted mind. My phone buzzed against the chipped Formica counter, displaying a number I didn't recognize. Most unknown calls these days were telemarketers or scammers, but something made me wipe my hands on the threadbare dish towel and answer anyway. Mr. Harrison, this is Margaret Chen from Chen, Morrison and Associates. The woman's voice carried that careful professional tone lawyers use when delivering life-changing news. I'm calling regarding the estate of Robert Harrison. I understand he was your son. The skillet slipped from my numb fingers, clattering into the sink with a sound that seemed to echo through my empty kitchen. Robert was my son, past tense now, 3 weeks buried in Riverside Cemetery while I was still learning to live with the silence he'd left behind. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. For 37 years, I'd been David Harrison, devoted father, reliable provider, the man who worked double shifts at the lumber mill so his boy could have everything I never did. Piano lessons, summer camps, college tuition paid in full without a single student loan. I'd given him my dreams, my savings, my unwavering belief that love could bridge any distance between us. I was wrong about almost everything. Robert had made his fortune in tech consulting, building a company worth millions, while I struggled to keep my mortgage current on a mill worker's pension. The success I'd sacrificed everything to give him had transformed my grateful son into someone who looked at me like an embarrassing reminder of where he'd come from. Our last conversation, if you could call it that, had been 6 months ago when he'd called to inform me he was updating his will. "Dad, I want you to know you shouldn't expect anything when I'm gone," he'd said with the casual cruelty that had become his signature. "Everything's going to charity. People who actually deserve it, who'll use it to better themselves instead of just existing." The words had hit like physical blows. 37 years of sacrifice reduced to just existing. I'd hung up that day and never heard from my son again, until the cancer took him, and I learned about his death from an obituary a neighbor showed me, my own son's passing discovered like a piece of local gossip. But now this lawyer was calling, and I couldn't understand why. If Robert had been telling the truth, if I truly was inheriting nothing, what business did his attorney have with me? "Mr. Harrison, are you still there?" Margaret's voice pulled me back to the moment. "Yes, I'm here. I don't understand why you're calling. My son made it very clear that I wouldn't be inheriting anything." A pause stretched across the line, filled with the kind of silence that precedes revelations. "Mr. Harrison, I think there are some things about your son's estate that you don't fully understand. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning? There are documents you need to see." Documents. The word felt heavy with possibility and dread in equal measure. What documents could exist that would matter to a man who'd been written out of his son's will? What was there to discuss beyond the final confirmation of my son's disappointment in the father who'd loved him unconditionally? I agreed to the meeting, more out of curiosity than hope, and spent the rest of that Tuesday evening sitting in Robert's old bedroom, now a shrine to the boy who'd grown into a stranger. His childhood trophies still lined the shelves I'd built with my own hands, each one representing a moment when I'd been the proudest father in the world. Little League championships, spelling bee victories, the science fair project we'd worked on together until midnight, testing different paper airplane designs. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, surrounded by evidence of our once perfect relationship, preparing to receive official confirmation that my son's final act had been to erase me from his life completely. Wednesday morning found me standing outside Chen, Morrison, and Associates, a glass tower that represented everything my son had achieved and everything I'd never be. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. I felt like an intruder in my only good suit, the navy blue one I'd worn to Robert's funeral, carrying the smell of mothballs and decades of careful preservation. Margaret Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of professional composure that came from delivering difficult news to grieving families. Her office overlooked the city where my son had built his empire, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view I'd never seen from this height. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for coming." She gestured toward a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Before we begin, I want you to know that your son spoke of you often during our meetings." The statement caught me off guard. Robert had spoken of me to his lawyer? The son who'd cut me out of his life had been discussing me with his attorney? He did? The question came out smaller than I'd intended, carrying more hope than I wanted to reveal. Margaret nodded, her expression softening slightly. More than you might expect. Your son was a complicated man, Mr. Harrison. Brilliant, successful, but carrying burdens I don't think he knew how to share. Burdens. What burdens could Robert have possibly carried? He'd had everything, achieved everything, built the kind of life I'd only dreamed of giving him. What could a millionaire tech executive possibly struggle with that he couldn't solve with his intelligence, his connections, his vast resources? I'm afraid I don't understand, I said, settling into the expensive chair that seemed designed for people more important than retired mill workers. My son made his feelings about me quite clear. He told me I'd inherit nothing because I was just existing, not contributing anything meaningful to the world. Something flickered across Margaret's face, an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise? Disappointment? She reached for a thick manila folder on her desk, the kind that suggested serious legal business. Mr. Harrison, did your son ever tell you about his company's first major contract? The one that really launched his success? The question seemed to come from nowhere, unrelated to inheritance discussions or will readings. He mentioned landing some big client early on, but he never shared details. We didn't talk much about his business. Margaret opened the folder, revealing documents that looked official and complicated, the kind of legal paperwork that governed the transfer of serious money. The client was Morrison Manufacturing. They needed a complete overhaul of their inventory management system. It was a $3 million contract that put Robert's company on the map. I nodded politely, still not understanding why this history lesson mattered to a man who'd been explicitly excluded from his son's legacy. Morrison Manufacturing, Margaret continued, was owned by James Morrison, my father. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible but not quite solid enough to grasp. Margaret's father had been Robert's first major client? The connection felt significant, but I couldn't understand how it related to me or why it would matter now that Robert was gone. My father made that decision to hire your son based on a recommendation, Margaret said, her voice carrying a weight that suggested we were approaching the heart of whatever revelation she'd called me here to hear. A recommendation from someone who vouched for Robert's character, his work ethic, his integrity. My heart began to beat faster, some instinct recognizing that we were approaching dangerous territory, the kind of information that could change everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son. The recommendation came from you, Mr. Harrison. The world tilted sideways. The expensive office, the city view, Margaret's professional composure. Everything became background noise to the impossibility of what she'd just said. I had recommended Robert to Morrison Manufacturing. I'd never even heard of Morrison Manufacturing until 30 seconds ago. That's impossible, I managed, my voice sounding distant and strange. I never recommended my son to anyone. I didn't even know what his business did exactly. Margaret was already reaching for another document, this one older, the paper slightly yellowed with age. Do you remember working with a James Morrison about 15 years ago? You were part of a crew renovating his company's warehouse facility. The memory hit like cold water. Jim Morrison, the owner who'd spent 3 days on the job site, not micromanaging, but genuinely interested in the craftsmanship, asking questions about load-bearing modifications and foundation reinforcements. He'd been impressed with my knowledge, my attention to detail, the way I'd caught potential problems before they became expensive mistakes. You told him about your son, Margaret continued, reading from what appeared to be handwritten notes, about how proud you were, how he was starting his own business, how he'd inherited your work ethic and integrity. My father was so impressed by you, by your character and competence, that when Robert approached him months later, he decided to give an untested consultant a chance based entirely on your recommendation. The revelation settled over me like a weight I wasn't prepared to carry. My son's first major success, the foundation of everything he'd built, had come from my reputation, from a casual conversation with a client who'd been impressed by my craftsmanship. Robert knew this? The question emerged from some deep place of need, the father in me desperate to understand whether my son had been aware of my role in his success. Margaret's expression grew complicated, layered with information she seemed reluctant to share. Your son knew. He found out about 2 years after landing the contract when my father mentioned it at a business dinner. Robert had been wondering why Morrison Manufacturing had taken such a risk on an unproven company. 2 years after the contract, Robert had known for over a decade that his first major success had come through me, through the reputation I'd built with honest work and careful attention to detail. Yet he'd never mentioned it, never acknowledged it, had instead spent those years growing more distant and contemptuous. Why didn't he ever tell me? The question came out broken, carrying 37 years of confusion and hurt. Margaret closed the folder, her movements deliberate and careful. Mr. Harrison, I think your son struggled with that knowledge more than you might realize. The success he was so proud of, the independence he'd fought to achieve, had come through his father's reputation. For someone who'd spent years trying to prove he was more than just a mill worker's son, that connection was complicated. Complicated. The word felt inadequate to describe the emotional landscape my son had been navigating. Here I'd been, believing he was ashamed of me, embarrassed by my blue-collar background and simple life. But maybe the reality had been more complex. Maybe he'd been struggling with the knowledge that his greatest achievement had roots in the very background he'd been trying to transcend. "There's more, Mr. Harrison," Margaret said, and something in her tone suggested we were finally approaching the real reason she'd called me here. "Your son's will contains provisions that I don't think you're aware of. Provisions that tell a very different story than the one you've been told." My hands found the armrests of the leather chair, gripping them like anchors in a storm that was reshaping everything I thought I knew about my son's final months. Margaret was watching me with the careful attention of someone who'd delivered shocking news before, measuring my reaction like a doctor monitoring vital signs. "What kind of provisions?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The past 20 minutes had already demolished the narrative I'd been living with for 6 months. How much more could my understanding of Robert's feelings withstand? Margaret reached for a different section of her desk, pulling out a document that looked newer than the others, bound in blue legal backing with official seals and signatures. "This is your son's will, executed 14 months ago. The version you're familiar with, the one about charitable donations, that was from a conversation Robert had with you, but it wasn't the final version." She placed the document between us on her polished desk, close enough that I could see the legal text but far enough away that I couldn't quite make out the specific words. The power dynamic was intentional, I realized. She was controlling the pace of this revelation, ensuring I absorbed each piece before moving to the next. "Your son spent considerable time with our firm in his final year," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "He was battling cancer, as you know, but he was also battling something else. Regret, Mr. Harrison. Deep, complicated regret about the relationship between you two. Regret." The word hit me like a physical blow. All those months when I'd thought Robert was simply living his successful life without giving his father a second thought, he'd been struggling with regret. The son who'd seemed so confident in his decision to cut me out had been wrestling with doubts. "He never showed any sign of regret," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Every conversation we had, every interaction, he seemed so certain that I was a disappointment to him. Margaret nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd heard similar stories before. "Your son was a proud man, Mr. Harrison. Perhaps too proud. He'd built his identity around being self-made, around transcending his background, acknowledging that his success had roots in your reputation, that his father had played a crucial role in his achievements. That was threatening to the image he'd constructed of himself." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "But pride and love aren't mutually exclusive. Robert could be proud and wrong at the same time." The phrase struck something deep in my chest. Proud and wrong. How many times had I been proud and wrong as a father? How many decisions had I made based on what I thought was best for Robert, without considering what he actually needed from me? "The will," I said, nodding toward the document on her desk. "What does it actually say?" Margaret opened to a page marked with several yellow tabs, her finger finding a specific paragraph. "Your son left detailed instructions about how his estate should be handled. The bulk of his assets, approximately $4.2 million, goes into a trust. $4.2 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like discussing the distance to the moon. I'd never imagined Robert had accumulated that kind of wealth, though I supposed I shouldn't have been surprised. Success in technology could generate fortunes that seemed impossible to someone who'd earned his living with his hands. "A trust for charity?" I asked, trying to reconcile this with what Robert had told me months earlier. Margaret's expression shifted, and for the first time since I'd entered her office, she smiled. Not the professional smile she'd been wearing, but something warmer, more personal. No, Mr. Harrison, a trust for you. The words didn't make sense at first. They bounced off my understanding like stones skipping across water, refusing to sink in and create the ripples they should have. A trust for me? Robert had created a trust for the father he'd claimed didn't deserve anything? I don't understand, I said, though part of me was beginning to, and the understanding was terrifying in its implications. He told me explicitly that I would inherit nothing. He said I was just existing, not contributing anything meaningful. Margaret closed the will and leaned back in her chair, studying me with what looked like sympathy. Your son was a complicated man, Mr. Harrison. He said a lot of things in anger that he later regretted. This will represent what he actually felt, not what he said in moments of frustration. She reached for another document, this one handwritten in Robert's familiar, careful script. He left you a letter as well. He spent weeks writing it, according to my notes. He'd come in here and work on it during our meetings, sometimes throwing away entire drafts because they didn't say what he really meant. My son had written me a letter? The same son who'd barely spoken to me in years had spent weeks crafting something he wanted me to read after he was gone. The contradiction between his words and his actions was creating a dissonance I couldn't resolve. Before I give you the letter, Margaret continued, I need to explain the terms of the trust. Your son was very specific about how he wanted this handled. She pulled out a different document, this one typed and official, filled with legal language that would have been incomprehensible without her explanation. The trust provides you with a monthly income of $8,000 for life. The principal remains intact, generating enough investment income to sustain those payments indefinitely. $8,000 a month, more than double my pension, enough to transform my daily existence from careful budgeting and constant worry about unexpected expenses to something approaching comfort. I could fix the roof that had been leaking for 2 years. I could replace the furnace that struggled through every winter. I could stop choosing between groceries and prescription medications. But more than the financial implications, the trust represented something I'd given up hope of ever receiving from my son. Acknowledgement. Recognition that I mattered to him, that our relationship had meant something despite the years of distance and disappointment. Why didn't he tell me? The question emerged from a place of deep confusion. If he felt this way, if he wanted to provide for me, why let me believe I meant nothing to him? Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. I think your son was afraid, Mr. Harrison, afraid of admitting he'd been wrong about some things, afraid of appearing weak or sentimental. He'd spent so many years building walls between you two that tearing them down felt impossible. She gestured toward the handwritten letter still sitting on her desk. But he also knew that actions speak louder than words. This trust, this letter, these are his real feelings. Not the angry words he spoke in moments of pride and stubbornness. The office fell quiet except for the subtle hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of city traffic 40 floors below. I sat in that expensive chair, surrounded by the evidence of my son's success, trying to reconcile the Robert who'd hurt me so deeply with the Robert who'd spent his final months ensuring I'd be provided for. But there's one more thing, Margaret said, reaching for a final document. The trust comes with a condition, not a legal requirement, but a request from your son. My chest tightened with apprehension. What condition could Robert have attached to his final gift to me? What last demand would he make from beyond the grave? He wants you to use some of the money to travel, Margaret explained, reading from what appeared to be Robert's handwritten instructions. He researched places you'd talked about visiting when he was young. Ireland, where your grandfather emigrated from. Alaska, where you always wanted to see the Northern Lights. The Grand Canyon, which you mentioned wanting to visit someday. The memories hit me like a physical force. Conversations from decades ago, casual comments I'd made about places I dreamed of seeing but could never afford to visit. Robert had been listening, even during those years when he'd seemed so distant and disinterested. He'd remembered my offhand remarks about wanting to trace our family history in County Cork, about wondering what the aurora borealis actually looked like beyond photographs. He remembered all that? I asked, my voice thick with emotions I couldn't quite identify. Margaret nodded. Your son remembered everything, Mr. Harrison. Every story you told him, every dream you shared, every sacrifice you made for his future. The problem wasn't that he didn't remember. The problem was that he remembered too well. She handed me the handwritten letter, several pages folded together, my name written across the front in Robert's careful script. He wanted you to read this here, in my presence, in case you had questions about the trust or needed help understanding his intentions. I took the letter with trembling hands, feeling the weight of paper that somehow contained my son's true feelings, his real thoughts about our relationship, and his regrets about how it had ended. The envelope was sealed with the kind of old-fashioned wax that suggested ceremony, importance, finality. Take your time, Margaret said softly. I'll be right here when you're ready. I broke the seal and unfolded pages covered in Robert's familiar handwriting, the same careful script I remembered from his childhood homework assignments, his thank you notes for birthday gifts, his college applications that had filled me with such pride. But now those familiar letters spelled out words I'd never expected to read, apologies I'd given up hope of ever receiving. The letter began simply, Dad, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Margaret is explaining what I couldn't bring myself to say while I was alive. I set the letter down for a moment, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't expected. Margaret quietly pushed a box of tissues across her desk, her expression understanding. The weight of Robert's words was already overwhelming, and I'd only read the first line. Taking a shaky breath, I continued reading. I've started this letter a dozen times, throwing away each attempt because nothing seemed adequate to express what I need you to know. Margaret has been patient with me, letting me use her office like my personal writing retreat, watching me struggle with words that should have come easily between a father and son. The handwriting grew slightly less controlled as the letter progressed, as if emotion had overtaken Robert's usual precision. The truth is, Dad, I've been a coward. For years, I've let pride and fear dictate how I treated the man who gave me everything. You worked yourself to the bone so I could have opportunities you never had, and instead of gratitude, I repaid you with distance and judgment. My chest tightened reading those words. The son who'd seemed so confident in his disappointment with me had been carrying this burden of guilt. All those years when I'd wondered what I'd done wrong as a father, Robert had been wrestling with his own sense of failure as a son. Do you remember when I was 12 and I wanted to quit Little League because Tommy Morrison was better at shortstop than me? You sat me down in our kitchen and told me that being the best wasn't the point. The point was showing up, trying your hardest, and treating people with respect along the way. You said that success without character was just expensive failure. I remembered that conversation perfectly. Robert had been devastated about losing his starting position, convinced that being second best meant he was worthless. I tried to teach him that his value wasn't determined by comparison to others, but by the effort he gave and the person he chose to be. I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way, Dad. I let success convince me that I was better than my raising, that I transcended my background through my own brilliance. When I found out that Morrison Manufacturing hired me because of your reputation, it shattered the story I'd been telling myself about being self-made. The letter paused there, a small ink blot suggesting Robert had stopped writing, perhaps struggling with how to continue. When the text resumed, his handwriting was smaller, more careful. I should have been proud that your character opened that door for me. Instead, I was angry. Angry that my greatest achievement had roots in the very background I'd been trying to escape. So I pushed you away, convinced myself that you were holding me back, that your simple life was somehow a judgment on the complex one I was building. Margaret was watching me carefully as I read, gauging my reaction to revelations that were reshaping everything I thought I knew about my son's motivations. The Robert emerging from this letter wasn't the cold, successful businessman who'd rejected his father. This was a man tortured by his own contradictions, trapped between love and pride. The cancer diagnosis changed everything, Dad. When Dr. Phillips told me I had 6 months, maybe a year if the treatments worked, all that success suddenly felt hollow. I wasn't thinking about my company or my investments or my reputation in the tech community. I was thinking about fishing trips we took when I was young, about the treehouse you built me in the backyard, about how proud you looked at my college graduation. I closed my eyes, remembering that graduation day. Robert had seemed embarrassed by my presence, uncomfortable when I tried to take pictures or celebrate his achievement. I'd attributed his distance to natural independence, a young man ready to make his own way in the world. Reading this letter, I realized he'd been embarrassed by his own embarrassment, caught between love for his father and shame about feeling that love. I started coming to Margaret's office to write this letter because I needed to tell you the truth before I ran out of time. The truth is that everything good about me came from you. My work ethic, my integrity, my stubborn refusal to give up when things get difficult, those are your gifts to me. The success I built on that foundation belongs to both of us. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, each one revealing layers of Robert's internal struggle that I'd never suspected existed. He wrote about specific memories I'd forgotten, moments that had apparently shaped him in ways I'd never understood. The time I'd stayed up all night helping him finish a science project, not by doing the work for him, but by asking questions that led him to solutions. The Christmas when money was tight, but I'd worked overtime for weeks to buy him the microscope he'd wanted, telling him that education was the one investment that never lost value. I know I hurt you with my words, Dad. When I told you that you were just existing, not contributing anything meaningful, I was really talking about my own fears. I was terrified of becoming irrelevant, of being forgotten, of not mattering in the grand scheme of things. I projected those fears onto you because it was easier than examining my own insecurities. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Your son spent months working with financial advisors to structure that trust, she said softly. He wanted to ensure you'd never have to worry about money again, but he also wanted it to come with freedom, not obligation. The monthly payments are designed to give you choices you've never had before. I looked up from the letter, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Robert had done. Not just the money, though that was life-changing, but the thought and care that had gone into every detail. He'd remembered conversations from decades ago, planned for my comfort and happiness, tried to give me the opportunities for adventure I'd always dreamed about but never pursued. Why the travel request? I asked, gesturing toward the letter. Why was that so important to him? Margaret smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her since entering the office. Your son felt guilty that you'd spent your entire life providing for him, never taking time for yourself. He researched those destinations obsessively, found tour companies that specialize in older travelers, looked into accessible accommodations. He wanted to give you the adventures you'd sacrificed for his education. The irony wasn't lost on me. Robert had spent his final months planning the kind of thoughtful, generous gestures that had characterized my entire relationship with him. The capacity for selfless love hadn't skipped a generation. It had just been buried under layers of pride and fear. I returned to the letter, reading Robert's final paragraphs through tears that made his careful handwriting blur and swim on the page. I know I waited too long to say these things, Dad. I know my pride cost us years we can't get back. But I need you to know that every success I achieved was built on the foundation you gave me. Every lesson you taught me about character and integrity guided my business decisions, even when I was too stubborn to admit it. The letter concluded with a paragraph that hit me like a physical blow. The trust isn't charity, Dad. It's not guilt money or an apology payment. It's recognition of a debt I can never fully repay. You invested your life in my future, and now I want to invest in yours. Use this money to see the world you helped me explore through books and dreams. Use it to live the adventures you postpone so I could have mine. And maybe, when you're standing on those Irish cliffs or watching the northern lights dance across the Alaskan sky, think of your son who loved you more than his pride would let him show. The signature at the bottom was simple. Your grateful son, Robert. I set the letter down on Margaret's desk, my hands shaking with emotions I couldn't name. Grief, certainly, for the relationship we'd never fully repaired. Relief that Robert's final feelings toward me had been love rather than disappointment, but also something else, something that felt like possibility. Margaret gave me several minutes to compose myself before speaking. There's one final element to your son's estate plan, she said, reaching for a small wooden box I hadn't noticed before. He left specific instructions about this. She placed the box between us, and I recognized it immediately. I'd made it in my workshop when Robert was 10, a simple jewelry box crafted from maple with a brass latch. He'd used it to store his baseball card collection, his Boy Scout badges, the small treasures that had mattered to him as a child. Open it, Margaret said gently. Inside, nestled in the blue velvet lining I remembered installing all those years ago, was my father's pocket watch. The Hamilton Railroad timepiece that had belonged to 3 generations of Harrison men, passed down from my grandfather to my father to me. I'd given it to Robert on his 18th birthday, telling him it represented the continuity of our family, the connection between past and future. But there was something else in the box, something that hadn't been there when I'd given it to Robert decades ago. A small brass key, old and worn, attached to a piece of paper with an address written in Robert's handwriting. Margaret was watching my reaction carefully. Your son bought a house, Mr. Harrison. Not an investment property or a vacation home, but a place specifically for you. He spent months looking for the perfect location, something close enough to your current neighborhood that you wouldn't feel displaced, but nicer than anywhere you'd ever lived. The address was in Riverside Heights, the area where I'd always admired the well-maintained homes and mature oak trees but never imagined I could afford to live. Robert had bought me a house. While telling me I'd inherit nothing, he'd been secretly purchasing a home designed for my comfort and happiness. The deed is in your name, Margaret continued, free and clear, no mortgage, no liens. Your son paid cash and had it fully renovated according to specifications he developed based on things you'd mentioned over the years. A workshop in the basement for woodworking, a screened porch for evening relaxation, a garden area where you could grow the tomatoes you always talked about. I stared at the key in my palm, this small piece of metal that represented my son's final expression of love. He'd remembered my casual comments about wanting a proper workshop, about missing the garden my mother had kept when I was young, about dreams I'd mentioned in passing without ever expecting them to be taken seriously. When can I see it? The question emerged from somewhere deep in my chest, from a place that had given up hope of new beginnings, but was suddenly, impossibly, beginning to believe in them again. Margaret checked her watch, a gesture that seemed to mark the transition from legal business to personal kindness. Your son left instructions that you should see the house today, if you were ready. He arranged for everything to be prepared for your arrival. She handed me a manila envelope thick with documents. The deed, the trust paperwork, contact information for the financial advisors who'll be managing your monthly payments. Everything you need to begin this new chapter of your life. I stood up from the leather chair that had held me through the most transformative hour of my life, my legs unsteady beneath me. The man who'd entered this office was David Harrison, the forgotten father who'd believed his son died, disappointed in him. The man preparing to leave was someone entirely different, someone whose son had loved him enough to spend his final months ensuring his father's future would be everything his past had lacked. Margaret, I said, turning back as I reached her office door, thank you for helping him with all this, for letting him use your office to write the letter, for making sure his real wishes were carried out. She smiled, and I could see genuine emotion behind her professional composure. Your son was one of my favorite clients, Mr. Harrison, not because of the fees he paid, but because of the man he was underneath all that pride and stubbornness. He loved you deeply, and helping him express that love was one of the most meaningful projects I've ever worked on. As I walked through the marble lobby toward the glass doors that led back to the world, I realized that everything had changed in the span of 2 hours. The father who'd entered this building had been preparing to spend his remaining years in quiet resignation, accepting that his relationship with his son had been a failure, that his life's work had been unappreciated and unrewarded. The father leaving this building had a future full of possibilities he'd never imagined, travel to places he'd only dreamed about, a home designed specifically for his comfort, financial security that would let him make choices based on desire rather than necessity. But more than the material gifts, Robert had given me something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that I had been a good father, that my love had been received and returned, that my life had mattered to the person who mattered most to me. The afternoon sun felt warmer on my face as I walked toward my old truck, knowing it would be one of the last times I'd drive it out of necessity rather than choice. Tomorrow, I would see the house Robert had chosen for me. Next month, I might book a flight to Ireland to walk the paths my grandfather had left behind. Next year, I could stand under the northern lights he'd wanted me to see. But today, I was simply a father who discovered that love, even when unexpressed, has a way of finding its voice when it matters most. My son's greatest gift hadn't been the money, or the house, or even the letter explaining his feelings. His greatest gift had been showing me that our relationship, despite all its complications and silences, had been built on a foundation of love that even death couldn't diminish. The key felt warm in my palm as I drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the corner grocery where I'd bought penny candy for Robert when he was small, past the elementary school where I'd attended every parent-teacher conference and cheered at every Christmas program. But instead of turning toward my cramped rental house with its sagging gutters and temperamental furnace, I followed the address written in my son's careful handwriting toward Riverside Heights. The GPS in my ancient truck guided me through increasingly pleasant neighborhoods where the lawns were emerald green and the mailboxes bore family names instead of apartment numbers. Oak trees formed canopies over streets I'd driven past countless times while working construction jobs in this area, never imagining I'd have reason to linger, much less belong. When I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, my heart began hammering against my ribs. The houses here were the kind I'd admired from a distance. Modest but well-maintained homes with front porches and established gardens, the sort of places where families put down roots and built memories across decades. This was where people lived who'd made good choices, who'd planned ahead, who deserved the stability I'd never quite achieved. The address led me to a cream-colored craftsman-style house with dark green shutters and a wraparound porch that beckoned like an old friend's embrace. A wooden swing hung from the porch ceiling, moving slightly in the afternoon breeze. The front yard was landscaped with native plants that would require minimal maintenance, showing consideration for an aging man who might not have the energy for elaborate gardening. I sat in my truck for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at what Robert had chosen for me. The house looked like it belonged to someone respectable, someone whose son might visit for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. It looked like a place where a grandfather might read bedtime stories to visiting children, where family traditions could be born and nurtured. The front door was painted a warm burgundy that complemented the cream siding perfectly. As I approached with the key Margaret had given me, I noticed details that spoke of Robert's attention to my unspoken preferences. A brass doorbell instead of a cheap plastic buzzer, window boxes beneath the front windows, already planted with herbs I could use for cooking, a small wooden bench beside the door where I could sit to remove muddy boots or rest packages while fumbling for keys. The key turned smoothly in a lock that felt solid and secure beneath my fingers. The door swung open to reveal hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows dressed with simple white curtains. The living room was furnished with comfortable pieces that managed to look both new and timeless. A leather sofa in rich brown, a matching armchair positioned to catch the light from the front windows, a coffee table made from reclaimed barnwood that reminded me of pieces I'd admired but never been able to afford. But it was the photographs that stopped me cold. Framed pictures lined the mantel above a brick fireplace, images I recognized from my own collection, but printed professionally and displayed with the care of a loving curator. Robert as a toddler, balanced on my shoulders at a county fair. The two of us holding up a string of fish from a camping trip when he was 12. His high school graduation, both of us grinning despite his earlier protests about family photos. Our last Christmas together before everything changed, before success and pride built walls between us that seemed insurmountable. He'd taken my memories and given them a place of honor in this house he'd chosen for me. Each photograph told a story of love and connection, evidence that our relationship had been real and meaningful despite its painful ending. The father and son in these pictures looked happy together, comfortable in each other's company, bound by something stronger than the disappointments that would later divide them. I walked through rooms that felt both foreign and familiar, seeing Robert's thoughtful touches everywhere. The kitchen was equipped with modern appliances but designed with an old-fashioned warmth that invited lingering over morning coffee and evening meals. A small breakfast nook overlooked the backyard, where I could see raised garden beds already prepared for planting. The windowsill above the sink held a collection of small potted herbs, basil and oregano and thyme, ready to be transplanted outside when spring weather arrived. The master bedroom was on the first floor, a consideration for aging knees that might struggle with stairs in coming years. The bed was already made with crisp white linens and a quilt in blues and greens that reminded me of one my mother had sewn decades ago. A comfortable reading chair sat beside the window, positioned to catch morning light, with a small table that held a reading lamp and space for coffee and books. But it was the basement that revealed the true depth of Robert's understanding of what would make me happy. The stairs led down to a fully equipped woodworking shop that surpassed anything I'd ever dreamed of owning. Professional-grade tools hung from pegboards with military precision. A workbench ran the length of one wall, its surface smooth and unmarked, waiting for projects that would give meaning to my remaining years. Lumber was stacked neatly in organized sections, different species sorted by size and grade. A note was taped to the workbench, written in Robert's familiar handwriting. "Dad, remember the birdhouses we made when I was 8? I still have mine on my office windowsill. I hope you'll build many more in this space and maybe someday teach your grandchildren the same lessons about patience and craftsmanship that you taught me." Grandchildren. The word hit me with unexpected force. Robert had never married, never mentioned wanting children, but somehow he'd held onto the possibility that his father might one day have grandchildren to spoil and teach and love. The optimism embedded in that single word was staggering, suggesting a future where our family line might continue, where the lessons I'd learned from my father and passed to Robert might find new expression in another generation. I ran my fingers along the smooth surface of the workbench, imagining the projects I might tackle in this space. Toys for children not yet born, furniture for friends who'd admired my craftsmanship over the years, repairs and improvements for neighbors who might become more than strangers in this new community Robert had chosen for me. The upstairs held 2 additional bedrooms, both furnished simply but comfortably. One had been set up as a guest room with a double bed and dresser, ready to welcome visitors I'd never been able to host in my cramped rental. The other served as a home office, complete with a desk, computer, and filing cabinet where I could manage the financial aspects of my transformed life. On the desk was another envelope with my name written in Robert's careful script. Inside, I found a letter shorter than the one Margaret had given me, but no less powerful in its impact. Dad, if you're reading this, you've seen the house, and I hope you understand what I was trying to say with every room, every piece of furniture, every detail I chose. This isn't just a place to live, it's a place to thrive, to pursue interests you've always deferred, to welcome people into a space that reflects the dignity you've always possessed, but perhaps never fully recognized in yourself. I know you'll protest that this is too much, that you don't deserve such generosity, but you're wrong, Dad. You deserve this and so much more. You deserve to wake up each morning in a place that honors the life you've lived and the love you've given. You deserve to have space for hobbies and interests beyond mere survival. You deserve to be comfortable in your own skin, in your own home, surrounded by reminders of the good man you've always been. The neighbors are expecting you. I spoke with Mrs. Chen next door about your interest in gardening. She's excited to share tips about growing vegetables in this climate. Mr. Rodriguez across the street is a retired carpenter who's looking forward to talking shop with someone who understands the satisfaction of working with your hands. The Johnsons 2 doors down have grandchildren who visit every weekend, and I may have mentioned that their new neighbor used to build amazing birdhouses. This is your beginning, Dad, not your ending. Use this house as a launching pad for adventures you've always wanted to pursue. Use the workshop to create beauty and function from raw materials. Use the guest rooms to host family and friends who've never had a proper place to visit you. Use the garden to grow food that tastes like the tomatoes from Grandma's backyard that you still talk about. Most importantly, use this gift to forgive me for taking so long to understand what you've always known. That love isn't diminished by pride, that success without family is hollow, that the greatest inheritance a father can leave his son isn't money, but character. And the greatest gift a son can give his father is recognition that those lessons were received, absorbed, and treasured. Welcome home, Dad. You've earned every bit of happiness this house can provide. Your loving son, Robert. I set the letter down on the desk that was now mine, in the office that was now mine, in the house that would be my home, for whatever years remained to me. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Chen working in her garden, and she looked up with a wave when she noticed movement in the upstairs window. A friendly gesture from a neighbor who already knew my name, thanks to my son's preparation. The late afternoon sun was painting the walls of my new home in shades of gold and amber, and I realized this was the first time in decades that I'd watched a sunset from a place that truly belonged to me. Not a rental where I hesitated to hang pictures or paint walls, not a temporary shelter where I counted the days until I could afford something better, but a home chosen specifically for my comfort and happiness. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I was surprised to see it was from Margaret Chen. Mr. Harrison, I hope you've had a chance to see the house. Your son left one more surprise for you. Check the refrigerator. And please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions about the trust or need help with anything else. Robert would want you to know you're not alone in this transition. I made my way back down to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing differently on stairs that belonged to me rather than some distant landlord. The refrigerator was a modern stainless steel model that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but when I opened the door, I found it stocked with groceries, chosen with the same careful attention Robert had given to every other detail. Real butter instead of the margarine I'd been buying to save money. Fresh vegetables that looked like they'd been picked that morning. A package of the premium coffee I'd splurged on exactly once in the past 5 years, savoring each cup because I knew I couldn't afford to replace it. Steaks thick enough to feed a working man, the kind I'd bought for Robert when he was growing and needed protein, but had stopped buying for myself when the budget got tight. But it was the note attached to a bottle of wine that brought tears to my eyes. Dad, this is the same vintage we shared at my college graduation dinner. I know you remember, because you kept the cork in your wallet for years, probably until it crumbled to pieces. Tonight, I want you to toast your new beginning with something that represents one of our happiest memories together. You deserve to celebrate, and I wish I could be there to clink glasses with you. The wine was a California Cabernet that had cost more than I usually spend on groceries in a week, but Robert had remembered it perfectly. I'd ordered it that night because I wanted to mark his achievement with something special, something that acknowledged the magnitude of what he'd accomplished and the pride I felt in calling him my son. The cork had indeed lived in my wallet until it disintegrated, a small reminder of the moment when our relationship still felt unbreakable. I found a corkscrew in a kitchen drawer that slid open smoothly on quality hardware, and poured myself a glass in crystal stemware that caught the evening light like liquid rubies. The wine tasted exactly as I remembered, rich and complex, worthy of celebration. Standing in my new kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my son's love and planning, I raised my glass toward the photographs on the mantel, toward the memory of the boy who'd grown into a man complicated enough to hurt me deeply while loving me completely. To second chances, I said aloud, my voice carrying through rooms that would echo with new memories, new conversations, new possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. And to sons who love their fathers enough to forgive them for being human. The wine warmed my chest as I walked through my new home one more time, seeing it not as a gift too generous to accept, but as recognition of a relationship that had been worth preserving despite its flaws. Robert hadn't just given me financial security or a comfortable place to live. He'd given me back my dignity, my sense of worth, my belief that the life I'd lived had mattered to the person whose opinion mattered most. Tomorrow, I would call the travel agent whose business card Margaret had tucked into the trust documents. Next week, I would introduce myself to neighbors who were already expecting me. Next month, I might stand in the Dublin airport, beginning a journey to trace my grandfather's footsteps through County Cork. But tonight, I was simply a father who discovered that love finds a way to express itself even when pride tries to silence it, that the greatest inheritances aren't counted in dollars, but in understanding, and that it's never too late for a new beginning, when that beginning is built on the foundation of a love that survives even death. The house settled around me with the comfortable sounds of a home accepting its new occupant, and I knew that Robert was finally at peace, knowing his father would spend his remaining years not just surviving, but truly living the life he'd always deserved.